Hello. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to the last event of this partnership meeting on Thursday, which is a panel discussion of the housing challenges facing immigrants. And I would like to let the people in the room know that in addition to our panelists, who will be introduced by the moderator, Fran Klodawsky, there are 38 people at the moment on the webinar. So you should be aware of that. With that, Fran, we'll pass it over to you.
Greetings, everyone. As Valerie said, my name is Fran Klodawsky. I'm a retired professor of geography and environmental studies from Carleton, and very pleased to be moderating this important panel. I want to begin by acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. The Algonquin peoples have lived on this land since time immemorial, and I am very grateful to have the opportunity to be present in this territory. So thank you for your interest in this panel on housing challenges for international migrants. It's a very important topic, and I'm quite convinced that you'll learn a great deal in the next 90 minutes. We're blessed with a fantastic lineup of experts who will first respond to a set of previously agreed to questions before opening up the discussion with the audience. I've been asked to keep my introductions very brief in order to use the time we have to maximum benefit. But be assured that each of these panelists have impressive and deep credentials and experience that they will draw upon in their responses. Dr. Vera Etches is Ottawa's well-known and highly respected medical officer of health. Appointed in 2018, she's fostered a culture of community and client engagement and is particularly committed to public health work to address inequities in health status stemming from racism and colonialism. Paul, over there, Lavigne, is the City of Ottawa's Director of Housing. He brings 35 years of experience in the health and social service sectors, having focused in areas of youth and adult justice, mental health and addictions, public and community health, as well as housing and homelessness. Suzanne Lee has been Executive Director of MultiFaith Housing Initiative since 2013, and in that capacity has overseen a period of impressive growth that continues to this day, including more than tripling MHI's unit count and operational budget. She's also served as the president and now past president of the Ontario Nonprofit Housing Association Board of Directors. Dr. Brian Ray, who's is an associate professor in the Department of Geography, Environment, and Geomatics at the University of Ottawa, and a member of the Inter-University Research Center of Montreal on Immigration, Integration, and Urban Dynamics. He's played a crucial role in knowledge mobilization strategies to facilitate knowledge transfers between researchers and diverse audiences. And finally, Dr. Damaris, who is over there, is currently an adjunct professor of urban studies at the Urbanization Culture Society Research Center of INRS, where she was a full professor until her retirement in 2017. She has specialized in and made many important contributions to research on the social dynamics of neighborhood change and housing issues for refugees, asylum claimants, and other newcomers to Canada. Please join me in welcoming all of them. Get my timing all set up because we're going to have to be very careful to make sure that we address all the things we want to. So in this first question, I want to begin by inviting first Suzanne and then Damaris to identify the key housing problems that currently are in play in Quebec, in Ontario and Quebec cities. In your answers, please focus on both the differences and their primary drivers across cities at the provincial level. So Suzanne?
So it's a very complicated question, and I'm going to try and sum it up very succinctly in 3 points or less in under 5 minutes. The 3 points I want to make of what is really causing the issue around housing is supply issue, landlord tenant board, this is in Ontario, funding and land, although some of it will apply across the board. Supply issue, the cost of construction, both for market developers and for not-for-profit developers, the high interest rates and the rapidly increasing costs of building housing, the whole issue around I hear a lot of talk about the financialization of housing and the commodification of housing being a big issue. Unfortunately, that's in my mind, a bit of a red herring. We build, own and operate housing. I know how much it costs to build. And so if the cost of construction is at $800,000 a door, then that's what it costs you to construct. We construct with no profit and just trying to meet our debt and make sure we get enough rent just to cover the debt. The higher the debt, the more rent you need to receive to cover it. And also for profit. So people that, again, that issue of trickle down is not going to solve the issue. Trying to keep on about 5 minutes. Landlord tenant board issues. In Ontario, we have a landlord tenant board that I would describe as in collapse. The time it takes to get a hearing at the landlord tenant board is now exceeding 9 months to a year for a hearing. So when you have people who are in housing that shouldn't be in that housing, that are overhoused, who haven't paid rent, or in some cases we know aren't actually in the housing, they've moved on, they've just held on to the rent, and we know that the units are sitting vacant. In some cases, you know, they might be in hospitals permanently, they might be in jail. They have no access to the unit, and these units are sitting there vacant. And because of our access to the landlord tenant board, we're not able to take house families that are living in shelters out of those shelters and put them into these vacant units. And so that is an issue that needs to be addressed. And also the landlord tenant board issue is causing the arrears to get so high that in a lot of my colleagues across the sector in Ontario, a lot of the smaller organizations are starting to see this issue as an existential threat, which means we could have a number of our not-for-profit and deeply affordable housing providers looking in the face of bankruptcy because of these very high levels of arrears before they could even act on it or be seen as landlord tenant board. If they go bankrupt, what happens is the risk of a lot of those units getting turned over to the market, being sold off to pay off the company's debt, and then we lose that affordable housing stock. And then the last thing I want to touch on is funding and land. Land costs money. Even governments are looking for a return on land. And so in order to have a project, in order to build, you need two things. You need land and you need funding. So if you have land, you've got to get it built on that. And then you have interest rates, and you have these increasing interest rates, increasing costs of borrowing, increasing costs of construction. But the cost of living, the basic cost of living allowances that Ontario works in, Ontario disability rates, are not increasing anywhere near in step between what it's costing to do the construction and to acquire the land. And the bureaucratic processes to acquire land is very, very expensive. So you're seeing this greatly widening gap between what it costs you to develop, own, and run the housing, what the funding is available, these lower interest of funding, and then what it's costing you in the land. So kind of just bringing those down, and I will unpack some of that a little bit more later, but I will now hand it over.
Hi, in spite of the request from Fran to talk about the differences between cities across the province, I really can't do that for Quebec. It's predominantly a Montreal focused set of responses and commentaries that I have. I will say that the urban structure of Quebec and Ontario are completely different. We don't have very many medium-sized cities. Things are dominated by Montreal and Quebec City. Yes, no, it's growing, of course, but anyway, my apologies for that, but most newcomers are in Montreal anyway. So everybody has this image that the housing situation is much better for lower income people in Quebec and in Montreal than in the rest of Canada, and especially in Ontario. And that's still true, but it's a lot less true than it used to be. And so I was asked to talk about kind of a little bit about the historical context of Quebec and what has happened. So historically, renting has been very predominant in the major urban centers. Home ownership has however, greatly increased in the suburbs and in gentrifying areas. with the condoization of old neighborhoods. Reasons why rents have historically been low are multiple, but the predominance of plexes, duplexes, triplexes, and fiveplexes in old construction, landlords being mostly small-scale investors, low operating expenses compared to multi-story buildings with elevators and complicated heating systems. Post-World War II, the construction is mostly walk-ups, far fewer high-rises than Ontario. The legal framework of renting is a bit different. Contrary to what many people think, we don't have rent control in Quebec. We have rent regulation via guidelines for what would be the normal increase. Renter has the option to contest above guideline increases or not. The big hic is if the apartment turns over, the new tenant may not know what the old rent is, and we don't have a lease registry, which has become a big issue. Deposits are not allowed, but that's increasingly flouted as rental housing becomes more scarce. Leases are transferable from one tenant to another, which is something that really helps to keep rents low if you're in the right network of people. But we have a Bill 37 that's trying to get rid of that transferability of leases. So we also have a history of funded tenants' rights committees that have helped people contest increases. History of co-ops and nonprofits fairly similar to Ontario, but with differences in terms of what kind of stock they're found in. So until recently, to sum it up, traditionally, poverty caused unaffordability of housing in Quebec cities. And in brief, in a nutshell, if I run out of time, according to a recent report from Centre de Grand Montréal, which is the United Way, housing unaffordability is now the major cause of poverty. So that's the big thing that's changed. There's been, in the past 10 to 15 years, a slowdown in the creation of social housing units through Quebec programs, an average of about 1,400 new subsidized units per year in the past 25 years, but that fewer incrementally every year. Aging and increasing disrepair of public rental and low-end private rental housing stock. And then the other thing, of course, after decades of economic stagnation, Montreal started to boom. So leading to middle class in-migration from Europe, from other provinces. A certain amount of financialization, but as Suzanne said, I wouldn't want to exaggerate it. But certainly accelerating gentrification, studentification, touristification through Airbnb. So it's still a lot less critical than in other provinces in terms of the unaffordability of housing for low-income people, but it's much more challenging than it used to be. And Centre has estimated that about 200,000 new affordable low-end of market or social housing units are needed in the next 10 years.
Thank you. You've both been very efficient, and we're good time-wise. One of the things that I was asked to probe about is the way in which the pandemic accelerated, highlighted, made worse or better certain issues. And I wonder if you could speak to that, the learning and the
Well, the pandemic, we all know, had a huge impact on the increase we saw record cost of living increases, which resulted in these high interest rates. These high interest rates reduced our borrowing capacity, the reduced borrowing capacity, and then combined with the increased cost of actual construction because of our labor shortages. And I gotta say, I don't understand what happened to our labor market. Like, where did they go? And so we're a lot of us are wandering around saying, where did everyone go? Because we lost a lot of our labor market in that pandemic, and they don't seem to have come back to work. And it's really quite harmful when you don't have the labor. It pushes the cost of actually getting the work done high, and then finding someone who will come and actually do the work. So for us to get housing built, it's been a huge setback. The LTB stopped hearings, put stays on hearings that were, everything kind of went still. And that, again, the Landlord Tenant Board, which I referred to earlier, that has caused the big issues we're facing right now is because of that, directly because of that. The backup they have is excessive. And then throw into the fact that the Ford government put a hiring freeze. And so there's not enough LTB adjudicators to actually hear the cases. And it's not just us who's getting hit by that. What that does, I heard you were talking about the little person who owns 1 or 2 units. That's a huge market of rental in Ontario. And because of this LTB issue, you're seeing those private owners getting out of the business. They don't want to deal with the LTB. They don't want to, why should I rent out my place to someone who's going to damage it, never pay their rent, and it's going to take me years to get them out at huge costs? Better to just sell it. So it's putting pressure in a lot of ways.
Sure. Well, I agree with all of that, and so I don't have to make one of the points I was going to make. On another tack, the pandemic really spotlighted the inequalities between owners and renters in Quebec and between inner cities and suburbs, because our rental neighborhoods in inner cities are such incredibly high density. So in terms of crowded conditions and access to conditional or lack of access to outdoor semi-public or public spaces, the issue of how much private space you had inside and outside your apartment became really, really important during the pandemic. And it had very negative impacts for families with young children and for teenagers, especially for the many months when we had a curfew, when it was broad daylight outside and kids had to come indoors. A major increase in the unhoused population in all cities and regions, and for that there is data that goes beyond Montreal, due to mental health and substance abuse issues getting much, much worse during the pandemic. But also paradoxically, a very transitory but positive impact. It just so happened that the 2021 census picked up on the fact that the rental housing affordability and housing core need dropped in 2021 compared to 2016. And that was because of the COVID benefits in improving the income situation temporarily for the precariously employed. And that's interesting because as some nonprofit, some progressive think tanks and major housing rights organizations have said, it's like an inadvertent experiment in a guaranteed minimum income. Yeah. But it didn't last. But it's been talked about and discussed as an interesting point.
That's great. Thank you for those. I'm just wondering if Brian, Vera, or Paul want to add anything to this sort of foundational question before we move on.
Well, in particular, the last point that you made, when we looked at our statistics in terms of the rate of homelessness, it's the only year in the last 20 years that we've seen a decrease year over year in homelessness with those benefits that were paid out. So
during that 1 year.
Absolutely, yeah. The data doesn't lie, the numbers are there, and it's something that should be considered, studied a lot more, and considered. Absolutely.
Well, we could just do it.
We could just do that because now it's been studied and it's true.
And of course, I'm here with very little that I can say about housing policy, but because of the COVID situation, we realized we need to get involved from a public health perspective. In fact, when you think about why are some people healthy and others aren't, it has almost everything to do with poverty as major determinant of health. Underneath that, of course, we also can see what drives poverty is racism and other determinants, but one of the biggest expenses people face is housing. And so that's what we saw in the pandemic was that there's disproportionate, of course, infection rates, hospitalizations, even death among populations that face disadvantage in income. So Black population in Ottawa, for sure, and newcomers. So within the Black population, it was people who are newer to the city and to Canada that were disproportionately affected even more. When you looked at rates by neighborhood, you could see that neighborhoods with lower income, more crowded housing, the characteristics you described, less public space, the rates were higher. So I think we are we are wanting to address this from a health point of view, and there's lots of other health impacts. It's not when you have crowded settings, you have more transmission of infectious disease, but it's also, you know, there are environmental health exposures, there are injuries, there are other ways housing quality affects health. So I think that's where
Yeah.
we're coming.
And in fact, really, we're sliding into the second question. So Brian, you can contribute.
So what I would say very briefly, one of the things that the COVID crisis has also highlighted is the multiple ways in which housing is being used today. And that increasingly where we're living is also a place where we're working, and how that coincides with other activities of other household members. And, you know, really importantly, the crisis shed light on the fact that in order to live in affordable housing, people are often living in fairly crowded conditions, which has severe health implications in a pandemic. And I think, you know, it's been decades since people thought about this. And I think that the crisis really has caused us to think again about, well, actually, how are people using housing and what are the implications for health?
Thank you. And we actually have begun to answer the second question, where I want to hear from Paul and Vera and Brian and Damaris about the implications of these housing challenges for diverse international migrants, in particular, albeit that they are a very diverse group across many dimensions, just to name a few: admission category, legal status, ethno-racial identity, sexual identity. So we've really begun to talk about that, but we want to hear more about the implications. What in terms of being an international migrant, faced with the housing challenges described in the first session, what do we need to really be thinking about and focusing on and probing? So.
Yeah, so I think you're absolutely right. We can't speak about all immigrants, but if you look at population of people who have immigrated within the last 10 years, you do see disadvantage in terms of access to regular healthcare providers. And that's by neighborhood. You can map this out by neighborhood as well. But at the individual level, you know, it's only 62% have a regular healthcare provider in they've immigrated in the last 10 years. And that's compared to 86% or so, 82% in the general population. So there's problem with access to the health supports needed. We are hearing from our education colleagues that people in crowded settings can't study, they can't complete homework, there aren't spaces to learn and so succeed, you know, at school and finding employment. Housing being that large expense, if you're paying most of your income towards housing, you don't have money left over for nutrition, healthy food, culturally appropriate food. So there are many ways you can see this starts to affect the well-being of families.
Paul, do you want to add?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And yes, as you know, international migrants face incredible challenges when coming to our country, and in particular trying to access affordable housing. Just on the social support side, there are barriers there in terms of accessing social support, and even, you know, the centralized wait list in Ontario, which is the centralized list for to apply for and access subsidized housing. And we do know that there's barriers accessing rentals due to the inability of providing, you know, references or credit checks, first and last month's rent. Landlords may not want to you know, rent to people that they don't know, or there's a long list of people who are trying to access the one unit, and it becomes incredibly competitive. Also, there are multiple immigration streams that exist that make it complicated for you know, international migrants, depending on which program, federal government program they're coming through, that have different benefits, different you know, timeframes and eligibility criteria. So it can be quite challenging and quite complicated to maneuver the system. But thankfully, we do have some resources that help people guide them through the system. but it is complex and it is inequitable between the different programs. So there would certainly be some merits in trying to harmonize the different programs so that the different migrants have an equal chance at navigating the system. And navigating the system is another issue that is quite complex. As you know, French, English is the primary languages, and so that can be an issue, language barriers as well, and which is exacerbated if people don't have people in Canada that they can support them through. One of the biggest challenges that we're facing when we're looking at housing issues is that our housing system is really not structured for multi-generational families. By that I mean, homes of 4, 5, 6, 7 bedrooms. You typically don't find that on the rental market. And so, typically you get bachelor, 1 bedroom, 2 bedroom, 3 bedrooms. So, and in a lot of international migrants, the families, there could be some very large families. So our system is not very structured to be accommodating to those needs. So just in terms of a stat here, according to the 2021 census data, 28.6% of newcomers to Canada report living in an overcrowded home. So, which is disproportionately high compared to 9.7% national. So 9.7% compared to 28.6. So, so that can be quite a big issue for folks. I'll pass it on to you.
Thank you.
So I would like to focus a little bit on 2 things. One is the diversity of immigrant classes coming to Canada, and the second is length of time. And what I'm going to say, I'm going to preface it by saying this is only about the Toronto metropolitan area. That's where I've done my most recent research from about this. Refugees have a very difficult time in Toronto's housing market. At least 50% of the refugee population who've been in Canada for 5 years or less are experiencing spending more than 30% of their income on housing. 50% of refugees in Toronto, and 21% spend more than 30%. 21% spend more than 50%, which is enormous. And if you look at other immigrant classes, such as the economic immigrants or family class immigrants, certainly the proportion is lower. But what is disturbing for economic immigrants, as well as for family class immigrants, is that it appears the longer that they stay in Canada, their situation does not improve until they've been here for at least 15 years or more. If you look at immigrants who arrive within the last five years and those who have been here from 15 to 5 years, from 5 to 15 years, there's almost no difference in the proportions that are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And that I think raises a whole series of interesting questions about, in order to deal with issues, for example, around crowding, whether some families are moving out of rental housing and into home ownership, but are taking on a lot of debt to do it. And so even though their physical housing might change, their debt situation doesn't change at all. We don't know. It would be a really interesting thing to know. But what the data reveal is that there, in terms of affordability, there isn't a significant improvement, even for economic immigrants, as time goes by. And that is I found that kind of shocking in the data, actually, because we all expect that things should get better as time goes by. The other thing that I would mention is that for temporary residents, that a very large proportion of temporary residents, falling just short of refugees, spend a disproportionate amount of their income on housing. And that's a category that would be really interesting to take apart as well, because it is such a heterogeneous category. It includes students, it includes people who are as temporary workers, as well as refugee claimants, and so it's a very heterogeneous set of people. But certainly that group is having a significant challenge in housing markets as well.
That is spinning.
Yeah, I have pulled out some of the same statistics as Paul, so I for about housing quality, so I won't duplicate that. I would just add that well, it's the recent refugee cohorts, including a lot of large families, such as the Syrian cohort, which really brought this to the fore. There's a real mismatch in the province of Quebec as well with what is available in the private rental stock. Where there is more availability is in the traditional provincial municipal low-cost housing, but then there's the whole question of who has access to that. But that will come into the next section where we talk about the effectiveness of current policies. There's another group that's crowded, although we would need special tabulations of census data again to look more deeply into that, because it's a question of immigration category. But what we think from different surveys that have been done at different points with asylum claimants and refugees is that single migrants arriving in the refugee categories sharing accommodation in order to cope are another source of crowding. But we need census data from special tabulations to be able to get it going to that. But there are a number of surveys that have been done in Quebec over the past 20 years that have consistently shown that as a pattern. The only other thing I wanted to add in regards to Montreal, I was talking about the contrast between renters and owners. What happens to the rental housing market? Newcomers have a greater stake in that than non-newcomers, in the sense that recent immigrants and non-permanent residents are more dependent on rental housing than non-immigrants. Another way of saying it in Quebec. Another way of saying that is in Montreal, very few newcomers become homeowners in their first few years after arrival in Canada. So what happens to rental affordability and quality matters even more for newcomers than for everybody else. And I think that's an important point. And I think the other points are statistical, and they've already been said one way or another.
Yeah, so we have a bit more time, and I keep hearing about it would be nice to study this and that. But with regard to this question of the implications for international migrants, what, in your opinions, are some priorities for research that should be done? The knowledge gaps that are most crying out for.
So if I would begin, I would say three things. What Damaris was just mentioning in terms of refugee claimants and what is happening to refugee claimants in our cities, I think is a really important question that deserves attention. It would be also really interesting to figure out what is happening to immigrants who transition out of rental housing and into owner-occupied housing, especially as interest rates increase, and what is going to be happening as we move forward in time. And the other thing that I think would be really interesting to know more about is that proportion of the population that isn't experiencing a housing affordability problem, and how are they doing it? Like what is happening for that group in terms of how they're making their way? And it might shine light on services that might be available in Canada, but it might also shine light on a whole elaborate system of social networks that would be interesting to know more about.
I've just realized that that's sort of the fifth question. So I think we'll sort of ask Suzanne if she has anything to add before we go on to the next question.
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that when we're looking at, I come from kind of the development point of view for deeply affordable housing. And when we look at that development from the development angle, at the outset, we need to be planning our communities and planning our development, our affordable housing development, with that eye of appropriate immigrant, appropriate and culturally appropriate housing. And Paul, you touched on that a bit about the larger units. You get the same funding from a development point of view. You get the same funding for kind of a 3-bedroom than you do for a 5-bedroom, but it costs you a lot more to build that 5-bedroom. So you're disincentivized to build it. In fact, you're disincentivized. You literally can't afford to build it. And so we need to be kind of putting our money where our mouth is and recognizing that if we're not going to have these overcrowded housing situations, we really need to be funding and putting that emphasis on building bigger units to accommodate these larger families that are coming through our door, because we do know that a lot of those immigrant families come in much larger numbers in their household than what you would see in a typical Canadian household.
Great, and that really slides into question 3, which I think we'll have a lively discussion around. So the third question is, how well do current policies address these housing challenges? And Suzanne and Damaris, you can decide between you which one wants to go first.
I went first last time.
All right, so, yeah, the way I interpreted the question was the effectiveness of current policies for easing migrants' housing problems, and I have negative things to say and positive things. And the first thing I'm going to say, it's going to sound facetious, but I have to say it. The CAT government that we have has tried to reduce the number of migrants, including lobbying the federal government to redirect the Roxham Road asylum claimants to Ontario, and then lobbying to get Roxham Road closed. So it hasn't had the desired effect, because it just means the same number of asylum claimants are coming, but they're coming from different countries and they're coming by air. This is what Stefan, who is from the TCRB, is saying. So that's the first thing I'll say. Newcomers to Quebec continue to face greater regulatory barriers for eligibility to social housing. I know that waiting lists are years long, and this might sound like an academic point, but there's a principle behind it. You can't get onto a waiting list for low rent public housing. You can't be eligible for a rent supplement for co-op and nonprofit housing or for portable housing allowance in Quebec unless you are permanent resident or citizen of Canada and a resident of the province of Quebec for 12 months in the past 24 months. And that, even a waiting list along everywhere in all provinces, this just creates an additional barrier, an additional delay for people who are eventually likely to be eligible, because they have to wait before they can get on any lists. And if you're a co-op or a nonprofit, you can offer a housing unit to an asylum claimant, but that asylum claimant can't get a rent supplement. So what's the use? Because they can't afford to pay the rent that you have to charge for your unit to balance the books. There are new regulations that I just found out about that have introduced the possibility of waiving this requirement, residency and status requirement for emergency housing of unhoused people, those experiencing domestic violence, leaving youth protection, and so on. But from what I read in the regulations, like so many other things, this is going to be micromanaged. So it's by senior bureaucrats that are going to hold decision makers accountable for why did you give an exception to that person in that category. So I don't know. It's really hard to answer this question further because housing policies in Quebec, as elsewhere in Canada, are in a state of flux. Quebec didn't sign the Canadian housing strategy, the National Housing Strategy, did sign an agreement, a bilateral agreement, but in the middle of the pandemic, and it's only really getting going, nobody seems to know what's happening. There's a shift toward more portable housing allowances, and more, up to $170 per month instead of $80 or $100, but the funding element envelope is very limited. The most important thing probably is that the main provincial funding stream for social housing construction and rent geared to income subsidy, called Accès Logis, is in the process of being phased out, and nobody really knows what's going to replace it. It seems like it's more of what we call bricolage, putting funds together from different sources, more philanthropic housing. On a more positive note, a couple of interesting developments. The City of Montreal lobbied for more powers from the provincial government, and has obtained since 2020 the right of first refusal to buy out private rental buildings for renovation and conversion to nonprofit. So right now the priority is the preservation of burning houses, but in future that could improve the supply of affordable walkouts in immigrant neighborhoods. And we had a wonderful program doing that in the 1980s in Montreal, and so this would be a new version of it. The problem is that the city will still have to buy the houses at the properties at market value. There's quite a lot of REITs in Montreal, a real estate investment trust that actually want to unload part of their portfolios. They don't want to be seen as the managers of low rent housing. They're actually interested in selling, but whether the city can actually afford to buy up enough of the stock, I don't know. Another positive element is that we have a robust infrastructure of nonprofit housing developers and providers to take up these kinds of opportunities. And we have new ones coming on stream, like there's a new organization, a nonprofit to develop student housing. Well, you'd see them, they're interested in international students as well as domestic students. So there are things happening on that front. The problem is simply the problem is the lack of money to get the credits from the provincial government to help get that going, even if other philanthropic or municipal partners can put in some of the money, but certainly the willingness is there. And those are positive developments.
So I believe in giving kudos where kudos is due. And I think that at a high level, we are seeing a real recognition that the housing crisis is here and that we need to do something about it. And the National Housing Strategy, which was the first time the federal government really kind of waded into that in decades, was a real indication that this was a priority for the government. And I know that as the sector, we absolutely applauded that National Housing Strategy. The issues that we run into is in implementation. And that is really kind of putting our money where our mouths are. You know, for example, with the National Housing Strategy, there's a big disconnect between loan versus grant. So you saw the National Housing Strategy come out, and you saw these big dollar figures beside it. And as a sector, we looked at it and went, yay, we're going to be able to build all this housing, and we're going to be able to house all these people living in shelters, and we're going to fix all these problems. Unfortunately, what we saw was this real push to for the housing to take as much debt as possible and give as little money as possible. The reality is it costs us the same to build the housing as it costs a market developer. We can't build for a penny cheaper. So when we're building, how do we make it affordable is we have to have grants at the top to offset that cost. And so when we get those grants, if the grants aren't sufficient, then the higher the grant, the lower the rent. And that's literally exactly how it works. So I can give an example of this. We were doing a build on a supportive housing facility in Ottawa, and we were working with CMHC on co-investment to get a grant. And they were trying to push us to a very, very high debt, as much as they could take. And we said, we can't afford that. We gave them the budget. Here's the amount of debt we can take. We must have a minimum of this amount of grant. They called us up and said, don't worry, we fixed your problem. You can take that debt because we found you savings. So we said, walk us through the budget. Tell us where the savings are. And so where they had found our savings is they had slashed our property management into 1/3 of what it really was. They had slashed our replacement reserve fund. That's the money that you put aside every year to make sure that the buildings are well maintained and well kept. And then they had brought our debt service coverage ratio down to a 1.0, which means for every dollar going in, we're just at break even. So now we have poorly managed buildings with no ability to fix anything when it goes wrong, and no replacement reserve to do anything about it, and no comfort room. So it just takes one person to put their fist through the wall, or one unit to go up in flames, or one thing to go really wrong, one hurricane, one tornado, and we've got a really big problem and no way to get out of it. We've got no breathing place. This is a very uncomfortable place. So when you have that kind of policy implementation, you have the top who are talking one level, and you have the bottom, the implementers, who are doing a very different thing. They're thinking that the best they can do in their job, the best way they can perform in their job, is to save the federal government as much money as possible and to give out as little of this as possible. Then we've got a really big problem. So that's kind of where I want to kind of leave that. It's great to have great policies, but the policies are not helpful when you're not giving the appropriate direction to those who are implementing the policies, and when they're not appropriately funded.
Suzanne, I think you've spoken at the federal level and Damaris has spoken at the provincial level.
Yeah.
Are you both able to sort of turn that around? And
I'm trying to, I like to say nice things and then say the criticisms, and I can't say a lot of great things about the Ontario government at this moment in time.
You're in Quebec.
The reality is they stepped off the stage when they're supposed to be the largest funders of housing when you look at how your funding portfolio looks. We did a development out in Barhaven, and of the $10 million that we got in grant, 6 million came from the province, 2 million came from the municipality, and 2 million came from the feds. When you take the province out of the equation, and now you're just dealing with whatever the city is able to scrounge up and give you, and I give Paul in the city in Ottawa, top hats, because they try really hard and they're very creative in trying to scrounge that money to make this work. And then you've got the federal government that wants to give you as much debt as possible and wants to give you as little loan. Then you've got a very big problem. Right now, COI is CAT co-investment, which is the funding for not-for-profit housing at the federal level, is capped at $25,000 a door. And the cost of developing housing is between kind of $6,000 and $100,000 a door. Well, that $25,000, and you've got debt coming in at 6%, that $25,000, that's not even buying you the doorknobs throughout the building, let alone the door. So we've got to really fund these issues. And honestly, I really think that the province of Ontario should not be let off the hook of their responsibility to funding housing. Their approach has been, we fund the market and the market will trickle down and that will fix the housing crisis. Well, we know that's not true. The reality is you have to look at affordable housing, deeply affordable housing as social infrastructure, and you need to fund it that way.
Damaris, do you want to add anything?
Well, Quebec isn't part of the National Housing Strategy. They refused to sign on. So I don't have much to say about the federal level, except that apparently under the bilateral agreement that was signed in 2020, there was supposed to be quite a bit of money from the feds for a repair program for the old public housing. We have a lot of vacant units in the public housing stock that were condemned. And in the past, the Société d'Habitation du Québec had very nimbly used the previous federal infrastructure program to say, hey, public housing is infrastructure, and they got money. But the person who lobbied for that succeeded, retired, and whoever took over never followed up, and so that kind of fizzled out. So it's good to see that the feds have agreed to hand over more money for repairs, and I presume that's the same in the other provinces. I just don't know about it. So
We just have a little bit of time left for this questions, but Paul, Brian?
Could I just very quickly add that for immigrants coming to Ontario in the rental sector, they face a very complex market, because how do you begin to explain to someone that your rents, if you're a unit that has been occupied before 2018, can increase by this much, but if you live in a unit that was built after 2018, it can increase by this much, and they look absolutely the same. I mean, it's a crazy making situation. And then try to explain the complexities of the social housing stock in Ontario as well, and that you have something called below market rent and rent geared to income housing, and try to explain that in a way that makes any sense. I mean, it must be crazy.
I would just say, as we're trying to learn about this sector and contribute, what we notice is different parties don't talk to each other, federal, provincial, local, cities, but also universities, healthcare, housing providers, economic developers who are bringing people and newcomers, to work. So there really seems to be a space where we need joined up policies at the federal level, connected to provincial and local, in terms of understanding and planning for the needs of people who are going to be arriving across different sectors.
That's great, Vera, and that's exactly what I was going to start off with. Is unfortunately the policies that are being developed, whether it be at the federal level, the provincial and municipal levels, there's no alignment. There's no strong collaboration that would say that when we develop policies and they're implemented, that all levels work in collaboration and for the best interest of of the person who's coming to our country. So I think we have a lot to learn and to do when it comes to working effectively together and developing policies that are not developed in a vacuum, and to make sure that we understand the reality on the ground, because every policy decision has an impact on people, real people who are coming to Canada. So, and it saddens me to think, and I see this every day, that we have newcomers, going to our mainstream shelter system, and that's the welcome to Canada. I think we can do a lot better than that.
We had personal support workers holding together care the best they could in long-term care homes, living in shelters.
Yeah.
It's
Absolutely.
Well, as usual, we're sliding into the next question, so that's perfect. And this is another very meaty one, which is what needs to be done in terms of policy changes and innovation. I think you've already sort of started to mention that, and people I want to draw upon initially, Brian, Paul, Vera, and Suzanne. So Brian, do you want to begin?
I think one of the things that we need to think about in terms of policy is, and trying to do better, is part picking up on what Vera was saying, is that we need better collaboration, but we also need to recognize that in Ontario, at least since the mid-1990s, we basically had a gutting of the people who had the expertise and who had the experience that led to really interesting housing innovations in the 1970s and 1980s. And it's really going to take a lot of work and effort to rebuild that expertise and to rebuild those partnerships. And thinking about a challenge and an innovation, it's going to, in part involve universities and other institutions really trying to recreate that expertise and that is a knowledge.
Okay, so in terms of policy changes and innovations, Paul, do you want to take the next?
Yeah, I think building on what we're saying is fostering better relationships at all level of government, and also recognizing the importance of relationship with the local sector, which is where people have the expertise and the knowledge, making sure that programs are adequately funded and services are adequately funded. And this is a good example of a policy decision where when it hits the road, there's a misalignment. So we have programs, policies around immigration, but then, at the front line, at the municipal level, the settlement services and the social services and the health services and all of the services that Vera was referring to, you have to have the infrastructure in place to care for people, to provide that support that people will need, that we all need. So there's a huge disconnect. And when it comes down to funding, there's a lot of ball throwing going around from the different levels of government. And at the municipal level, we're very limited in terms of the funds that we can tap into as a municipality to fund services. So there needs to be a greater alignment between all levels of government when it comes to funding essential programs that will support our people coming to Canada.
Anyone? I don't know that I have too much more to add, except to say one of the ways we try to work in public health is to work with the community. And so I think partly having mechanisms for people to speak about what their experience is, to enable that voice to be heard and to build in what people are saying they need when they arrive in Canada in terms of housing, I think is it's a public health method and a way of working that I think is applicable here to be able to get to relevant and effective outcomes. I think we are trying to plan ahead. So you can't get where you want to go without a plan. So I think having enough collaboration and the right players together to say, this is actually where we want to go, and this is what it will take to get there, and to seek support for these kinds of solutions. It's not, it doesn't work just to say that things are bad, right? So we're thinking about how you create these collective plans where people can together say, well, this is the part I can contribute, this is the part I can contribute. That's something we're exploring.
Just following off the theme of what you're hearing here, funded, it needs to be funded. The housing just is underfunded. That's the end of the day. You can't take someone who's homeless and make them not homeless if you don't have the money to create the bricks and mortar, to build the houses, to put them in. Also recognizing that housing is the long game. If there's no quick solution, that kind of turnaround, can we get people housed and out of the shelters in the next 6 weeks? No. We can put in place Band-Aid solutions, and we've talked about different subsidies and different subsidy programs. The kind of traveling bursaries that people get to help cover the rent is great as a Band-Aid. It stops the bleed for now, but it's not the long-term solution. We have to really build this infrastructure in our society and look at it, and it takes 5 years from the time that you start thinking about the housing to getting through your application process, to getting through your site plan, to pricing the whole thing out and getting shovels in the ground, build it, and then get rented in. We need to stop looking for the instant successes. And I do think that governments tend to think in 4-year tranches, which is conveniently, what can I achieve in 4 years? What can I, that I can have that at the end. And so it would be really good if we could start really looking at that longer term focus of how we fix our housing crisis. Another thing that I just touched on that we haven't really talked about, and that is that I believe that affordable housing, as they're going through these processes, should be given preferential treatment over market developers when we're going through our site plan, our rezoning, all of this thing. It drives me a little crazy when we put up a sign and it says, we're going to build an affordable housing project here. Please call us and give us your feedback. Well, you know what the feedback's going to be. We don't want it. And also, what business is it of the neighbors how much money my tenants make? Like, I find that a little offensive. When I moved into my neighborhood and bought my house, I didn't get to find out the income levels of everyone else on the street. That's private information. I really don't think it's anyone's concern but ours. I get that governments want to be able to say, we're building this affordable housing, but can we do it in some way that doesn't put it right on the sign? So, we talk about time equals money. The time, if we can shorten the amount of time it takes us, rezoning takes a year, site plan takes another year. If we could shorten those timelines, we could get things built a little faster, and maybe we could shorten that 5-year trajectory I was talking about. But in our world, it's not just time equals money. Time equals money plus compassion. It takes people out. The longer it takes us to build, the longer a family is living in a shelter. That's what it comes down to.
Okay, I think I want to push actually all of you to sort of become a little more concrete. What are some stories of things that have worked well? Are there examples where learning could take place that you could draw on in terms of this question of policy changes, innovations? Have there been moments where different actors came together and something happened effectively? Because I think this notion of greater coordination and talking across sectors and so on, it's great in the abstract, but when you think about the way municipal, provincial, federal governments now work in lots and lots of silos and so on, there's a long way to go. So I think if there are some moments, it would be really useful, I think, to hear about those moments. Paul?
Yeah, I have a recent example with between the federal government, the province, and municipalities across Ontario. There is a housing benefit called the Canada-Ontario Housing Benefit. And given the exponential increase in international migrants and the need for access to affordable housing, because what you get from social support and the cost of housing, you need additional support. So through that, the COB is able to be offered to newcomers, which is for the first time. So that's great.
And how did that come about? Sort of what was the backstory? that made
Unfortunately,
that-
I think we needed a crisis. It's in response to a crisis, which shouldn't be,
But often is the case.
yes.
Can I go back in history?
Yeah.
So, I think back to something like the St. Lawrence Project in Toronto. And there you had federal and provincial governments actively involved in land consolidation. And by consolidating so much private land, they were able to build things that they could take advantage of economies of scale. Why should social housing be restricted to building 4 units where you get no economies of scale versus a private developer that can build 250 units? That seems like being able to do big things like that. And then once the land was consolidated, to have a good working relationship between CMHC. Ontario actually had a housing ministry at one time and had people who knew housing and worked with community organizations to build housing that responded to a variety of different household types. We knew how to do this in Canada. And I sort of wonder sometimes, given that we have framed housing in this country as being a private issue, whether we need to call it something else. Let's pick up Suzanne's term, which is, let's call it infrastructure. Maybe if we called it infrastructure, then we'd put public money behind it.
I don't know, it seems like a promising practice. I can't tell you it's yielded results yet, but with the work of Jillian and people on Paul's team, we are realizing that we can probably join up the housing caseworkers and health caseworkers and get better outcomes for people's well-being. Because housing doesn't always know how to navigate the health supports that might be needed, whether it's mental health, culturally appropriate services, substance use, and the health people, again, are seeing this need for housing, but not always able to navigate housing solutions. So this is something I'm excited about, and I hope will make a difference.
For MultiFaith Housing Initiative, I would come at it less from the kind of government. When I think of all of our successes come from our partnerships. So you were just talking about that kind of, joining up the health networks and the housing. We've been able to do that with partnerships with Live, Work, Play. We have adults with cognitive disabilities living in our units, and they get supported through the agency. So we develop that relationship with the agency. We set aside housing for them. We have units set aside for people coming from Catholic Center for Immigrants, so newcomers and refugees. And again, it brings in all the support comes with them, and then it also feeds into the community. So we've had a lot of success with that. And on the development side, because I'll also come at it from the affordable housing developer side, we're right now doing a project with a market developer, Dream Incorporated at LeBreton Flats next to the library parcel. And it is a total of 608 units and in 2 towers. And we will own 133 of those units. We're going to own a big chunk of the building from this floor to this floor. And what that has given us is it's given us access to economies of scale, the really good economies of scale. We're able to build at a much lower price. We're going to be able to manage the building at a lower price because we'll have access to the same maintenance contracts and things like that that Dream will be using. So it'll go to the 2 big buildings. And then on top of that, on their side, we're going to be working with them to do the community engagement work that we do. That's part of a big part of our culture. And we will be doing that for all 608 units. So kids will be, from our deeply affordable units, will be going to homework classes and yoga classes and after school programs and gardening programs and knitting and crocheting classes, and people like that thing. And they'll be doing all of that together. The ones who are in the higher end units and the full market expensive top floor units together with all together, one cohesive community. And so it's going to be a really beautiful thing. It's very exciting. What needs to happen, we've been able to access by working together, Dream with MHI, how we maneuver this project through. What we now need is the policies and the framework that is kind of being made up on the fly, because this kind of partnership hasn't really happened before. So how getting those things that are being made up on the fly to actually be institutionalized. So it really encourages this kind of future development. in other urban areas across the country.
Damaris, is there something?
Well, I don't think so, except what I said before is that, targeting a little bit more to the Quebec specificity, I'd like to see really like a massive socialization of the post-war low-rise rental stock. But we have to have creative funding solutions to that, given there has to be a way of stabilizing construction and renovation costs, as Suzanne was saying, because it's impossible in the current market. The available grants just are a drop in the bucket. But I would like to see us, up to a certain point, looking again at European models for generating funds for social housing. 1%, and then whatever they do in the 1% in France, the employer contributions. We can't just rely on traditional systems. The needs are too great for new construction and for renovation. We have to have ways of getting ordinary middle-class people to invest in funds that will be used for affordable housing rather than in private REITs.
So once again, we're sliding into the final question about what needs to be done in terms of research. And again, I think it's not only the research questions, but how those, research endeavors are put together. And I'll just, mention that there is a deep interest at MHI in doing a process evaluation of this Green Le Breton initiative, because there's so much that could be learned if we, started yesterday and kept going for 5 to 10 years. But I want to hear from, well, initially Brian and Vera about research in terms of, the what questions, but the how questions as well, given all that we've been speaking about.
Well, the biggest chunk of taxpayers' money goes into healthcare. And I do wonder if there is an economic argument to be made about the return on investment for building affordable housing in terms of the money you save on healthcare costs. And people have looked at this in small scale in terms of, I don't think they would mind me saying, Ottawa Community Housing has looked at some of their buildings as affordable housing where they don't have access to healthcare. The emergency room visits, the 911 calls, they're astronomical and they're costly. And so I think that's something, I could add from a health perspective that could maybe help with the business case for investing in housing.
For me, I think one of the things that would be really interesting to know more about is issues around the amount of space that people have in housing, especially in apartment housing, rental housing, and especially as housing is being used for multiple purposes more today than ever before. I think that we have long neglected how people are living in housing. We've asked important questions about affordability, and in no way do I want to diminish the importance of affordability. But I think that for, especially for children and women, that knowing something about the ways in which housing is used and the degree to which space and crowding is an issue, especially if we're increasing the number of people who are coming into major cities like Toronto and Ottawa, that it would be really, it's imperative to know more about how people are living in housing, and I think a whole variety of questions tumble from that, especially health.
Do the others want to add something? Paul?
Yeah, I think there would be some benefits in doing some research, qualitative research to understand the journey of newcomers from their point of arriving in Canada and until the time that they're housed. So really, walking in people's shoes and really getting a good understanding of what that's like. And I think we can all get a better appreciation of the challenges and barriers and really know how to fix things. And having people with lived experience, inform our policies to do that.
Yeah, I agree with that, but I'm looking at Jill because we have some of that information in surveys that are done in different cities, but what we need is like an ongoing, we need the qualitative, but I think we also need surveys that where the information is comparable across different provinces and cities. So we need to get the federal government to fund an ongoing longitudinal research that would complement qualitative work and that you're talking about, and vice versa.
I think it's decided then.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add there is it's great to do all this research and I agree. I think if we look at homeless population, that's not free. Keeping them homeless is not free. It costs us a lot of money. There was a researcher who came and spoke at MultiFaith Housing Initiative's National Housing Day event a few years back, and she was talking about how the research she did, 50% of children showing up at CHEO emergency room had core housing need that was contributing to their issue for which they were showing up at the emergency room. So you look at what that cost the system. So we can look at all that, but it's great to do all this research. The issue is you got to use the research. You can't just do it and then it gets shoved to the side and forgotten about. It actually has to be promoted and pushed and used to inform policy. And if it's not, then we can't do it for the sake of doing it. We need to make good use of it.
So that really leads into the question that I again want to push. Where are the research centers? Where is this kind of work going on or could be enhanced? Really push in the kinds of directions that we've been hearing from all of you. Are there places that are the ideal places, or does that need to be created? And if so, then what's the best way of sort of moving forward in creating that kind of research? I agree very much with Brian. We did have this incredible nonprofit housing infrastructure ecosystem in the 70s and 80s that is badly depleted, but that it needs to be it needs to rise from the ashes. So how can that take place, and where are there obvious places where it's beginning, where there's some?
Yeah, I would say Ottawa is an example. I mean, what we refer to the social housing stock. I think many cities across the country have those. And over time, as we learned more, as we did more research, we discovered that particular model was not good for everyone in terms of building inclusive communities and the ghettoizing that resulted from that. But we've continued to build. We stopped the social housing, but we continued to build affordable housing. And actually, those communities, those old social housing communities, are now coming, and many of them have come to the end of their life cycle. So they're being reconstructed again, but with a mixed income, within mixed communities. So not to repeat the ghettoizing of the social housing portfolio.
So Damaris just mentioned that there are 8 questions waiting to be asked.
I'm counting you guys.
And there's probably 1 or 2 questions that you have among you. So I will sort of transition to the Q&A, but I first want to ask the panelists if they have anything that they really feel they need to say before we open it up for questions. No. Okay.
I have one thing to say. What I want to say is we as a society need to recognize that a healthy, affordable housing sector means a healthy, affordable, and healthy society for everyone. Everyone wins in this scenario. No matter who you are, we need to have that.
That's great. It's a great closing remark. So let's listen to the questions, Valerie.
So I have a terrible feeling you could see these questions. I want to start with the one about international migrants. Someone is asking that building code and zoning are not accommodating newcomer family types. And later on, another question asks, could we address that by providing subsidies, not on the basis of number of units, but number of bedrooms? And I wonder if anybody on the panel could respond to both those, to that combined question.
From a builder perspective.
From a builder perspective, I'd love it if we were funded by bedrooms. That would be great for us. Because the reality, building code, I don't know the statistics on the physical needs, the disability needs of for accessible units among migrant versus the regular Canadian public. But I can tell you that we do know that migrant families or immigrant families, newcomers, refugee families come in much larger family sizes than the regular Canadian household or the average Canadian household. And so we aren't building units big enough for them. In our biggest community out in Barrhaven, we actually have some family units that have broken up into like 2 and 3 different households. And so they still are able to have their kind of community and have their space, and it's worked quite well. But the reality is that the most culturally appropriate thing we could do is be starting to include larger units into our portfolios, those 4, 5, and 6 bedrooms instead of 1, 2, 3, and a few 4s.
Okay, then there's a lot of questions about asylum seekers. Okay, which is not surprising because you can't listen to the news, turn on the news, or read the news. So one person asks, to what extent are refugee climate-specific shelters like Romero House in Toronto or Matthew House in Toronto or FCJ, to what extent are they part of the solution for housing accessibility for newly arrived asylum seekers?
They are a big part of the services and the care and the support that they provide, and think it's great that we absolutely need those organizations. I think what is currently happening though is an incredible pressure being put on those organizations and settlement services and all services across the board that it's compromising our ability to meet the needs of adequately meet the needs of newcomers. So absolutely, those organizations are doing a fantastic job, and they need to be resourced more appropriately to meet with the increasing demand.
So in addition to that, Paul,
Yes.
in Toronto, we are proposing to spend $8.6 million renaming, Debbie, have I got it right, Dundas Street? Yes. So someone asks the panel as a whole, it would be interesting to hear from several of you, should that money be redirected to meet the immediate housing needs of asylum seekers?
Yeah, it's that question either or, right? I mean, we could be here for days analyzing, how we spend money over here. Shouldn't it be spent over there? I think it's not an easy discussion to have, and we can analyze a lot of different things that have been spent on without judging the City of Toronto decision for that. It's easy to say, well, of course you should spend it on, this and that, but I can see both sides, and it's not an easy situation.
I would make a comment more broadly that the public is not well informed about what they get for their money or where money should be spent for the best return on investment. So I do think there's a role for cities, and I'm excited about the upcoming budget in Ottawa. I think they're going to try to actually lift out some of the data and show where the money's going and how much service results from this kind of investment. I think we need the knowledge translation and the discussions about how everyone benefits, right? When there are investments in housing that's more affordable or supported, what dollars are saved on paramedic calls, where that shows up on your tax bill. Like, I just think there's something that participatory budgeting is an interesting concept we have really not explored very much in, say, Ottawa.
Thanks, that's a great comment. So finally, are there questions in the room that, yes?
I was just thinking about if I were homeless and I lived on Dundas Street in a tent, I guess I would want coverage of my situation as they're changing those signs. Because it surely is, it's about whose voice is heard. And so, you know, it's probably time we saw in the one example I gave you that it makes a difference earlier in the day, makes a difference what we do as public sector and how, or public people, like just people, and how the homeless or other groups can stand up for it. So, yeah.
Are there questions that you, yes?
I actually have a really technical question for Paul from Ottawa Housing. Toronto Housing, we were having a conversation as I guess we're about 10 years ahead of you in needing to replace our stock and have moved, as you know, to mixed community housing. And right now with Toronto Housing, we have about a 89-11 split between market rent and rent geared to income. And there's a conversation happening politically about changing that ratio and probably moving more to 70-30. I've even heard 60-40 from some of our political people in the middle of a housing crisis of the affordable housing. What's Ottawa's ratio, and what's your thinking in terms of rent geared to income versus market rent, understanding the financial pressures on municipalities to build housing, right? Money that they need for an income stream from housing providers like Ottawa Housing and Joe.
Yeah, certainly well, absolutely, the need is all around. There's more need for rent geared to income housing, like you're putting out, and that's for those of who are not aware. That's based on the definition of 30% of person's income, and then that's kind of the lowest, the deepest affordability that of the programs that we have, and then it goes up to. Go up to 80% of average market rent, and then there's average market rent, there's below market rent, and then finally the market rent. So and there's affordability is on a spectrum, and there's a need for different affordability levels for different people in society. And one of the greatest question, if you're ever with a group of people and want to talk for hours, just ask them the definition of housing affordability. And that will get you talking for a long time, because what is that exactly? And who is it? Try to define it is not easy. So I would say the need is so great that we need, we need more affordable housing for all the different income levels. And, as evidenced by our data, we have approximately 12,000 households on our centralized wait list for subsidized housing who need deeper affordability, whether it's housing allowances or rent geared to income. The social assistance program are just not cutting it. They just can't provide the level of income that people need to pay for their housing.
Your questions? One more online. Okay, over to you, Bella.
There's one more question online. This person asks, there's a lot of emphasis right now with international students creating demand for housing. And he wonders what the panelists think of this argument that international students are somehow contributing to the current imbalance between housing shortage and between housing supply and housing demand.
Can I add to that question?
You definitely.
Answers, and what do you think the role of post-secondary institutions for bringing international students should be in housing provision?
And the financing of post-secondary.
Yeah, that's what I was gonna say. So we spoke to post-secondary institutions about this, and what they said is they're dependent on international student enrollment and those revenues to operate.
Yeah.
They really are. And that in Ontario, the Ministry of Colleges and Universities frozen tuition fees. So they like a policy that unfreezes tuition fees, so they can generate more revenue there. They also report, it's not my area of expertise, but the Canada Social Transfer goes up by 3% every year, which funds universities and other things. And that 3% increase a year has not gone to universities. And so at least asking the province to pass on the 3% increase that they get from the federal government to the universities would help with their operating costs. They also are interested in capital funding so that they can build, because it's the building cost. They're willing to build and run housing, but they can't build it right now. Just what you're saying with the high interest rates, with the cost of construction, they can't get started. So they're looking for some capital investment to be able to start and build more as well. And then they think they can contribute to that labor shortage. So some of the colleges are training grounds for the construction industry. And so they're also interested in incentives to help people get into construction industry to help solve the labor shortage.
Yeah, and don't international students also work here?
Yeah.
They'll study and they can work.
And that's something to remember, that the immigrants coming in are a help to that labor shortage all around.
Yeah.
When I say everyone wins, I mean everyone wins. We talk, how many of you in this last year have been stuck on the tarmac because of luggage being not loaded or being unloaded because they don't have baggage handlers? Well, baggage handlers can't afford to live near the airports because they're getting paid minimum wage. So where's the breakdown of that? So you have to look at how we can kind of really look at it from a whole societal perspective. I'm not a fan of saying, oh, students are causing our problem. Oh, looking for that boogeyman, that scapegoat who we blame. And so I really don't like that kind of analogy. There is, student housing is a problem, but it's a problem for those students. And I feel really bad for people who are lured here. There was a big expose on W5, I think a few weeks back, where they talked about all these international students being lured here, and with these great university opportunities, they're going to go to school and they're paying top dollar. What we pay is a fraction compared to what they pay to go to our universities. So they are subsidizing our children in the universities, and then they can't find a place to live, and they're living in cars and tents and what have you. We've got to look at what responsibility we have as a society for bringing in these students and then not having housing for them.
Thank you, Suzanne. So sadly.
Can I say one quick thing?
Sure.
I just was chatting about this a little bit earlier. I think those are great points. And I was looking at Educan Canada's website on the way here. The first thing it says is you'll find a high standard of living as a student in Canada. And then the second thing is you can find an affordable option. And it kind of makes my blood boil sometimes when I hear international students are the issue here, because I don't exactly know how budgets work with universities, but like last year, UVic got $280 million from the provincial government. UBC made $600 million on international student tuition. And I would like to see a little bit more positive messaging from the government about what international students are doing for this country, because last year, I think the Canadian economy generated $21.5 billion from international student tuition, which is more than lumber, auto parts, and electronic part exports. So I just wanted to throw out an angry.
I think that's an excellent sort of illustration of a lot of things that we've been talking about in terms of, talking to across our different sort of siloed understandings of the housing issue and policy issues and so on to a sort of whole of society issue and what is of benefit. So thank you for those remarks. And thank you so much to all of you. You've really shared wonderful knowledge, and I gained tremendously. So thank you very much.